Hello everyone. In this video, we will continue to examine topic D.2, stellar characteristics and stellar evolution, and in particular, we will seek to understand Cepheid variable stars. We will learn to describe the reason for the variation of Cepheid variables and to determine distance using data on Cepheid variables. So in this section, we study the use of Cepheid variable stars as standard candles. Recall that what a standard candle is something where we know the luminosity, or at least we can determine the luminosity. And if we know the luminosity, then together with a measurement of the brightness, we can acquire the distance. We can figure out how far away they are. So they're part of the distance ladder here. And Cepheid variable stars are a class of red giant. So they're a certain kind of red giant existing in a part of the HR diagram called the instability strip. And they pulsate in size and luminosity on sort of human length time scales. They get much, much bigger and much more luminous and then shrink again regularly. And you can see that if you measure the luminosity versus the time for a particular Cepheid star, then the luminosity will go up and then drop again slowly, and then go up and drop again slowly. And that gives a sort of stable period. So you can measure the period of this pulsation. Given that the luminosity is varying like this, the brightness also varies like this. So if you measure the brightness of an identified Cepheid variable star, you get a very characteristic pulsating graph in the brightness curve. So why do they pulsate? That'll be our first question. Well, ultimately, this class of red giant has a lot of helium, and the helium causes a lag in the hydrostatic equilibrium due to opacity. So remember that hydrostatic equilibrium refers to the state of the star in which there is a balance between the radiation pressure and the gravitational pressure. This keeps the star at a sort of fixed size, depending on the relative strength of those two things. Why? Well, if you increase the pressure, for whatever reason, if you increase that gravitational pressure, the temperature of the star goes up, and that causes an increase in the radiation pressure, which then serves to puff the star out again and reduce that gravitational pressure. So you get sort of this balance known as hydrostatic equilibrium. But Cepheid variables don't quite obey that. There's a lag in the whole process. And to understand this, we'll sort of jump into the cycle a little bit. So say for a second that the outer helium layer becomes compressed. Ignore why for now, just assume it sort of squishes inwards for a little bit. What happens is something that right at those energy levels, okay, the helium ionizes at that point. So the temperature gets just high enough to ionize the helium. And this absorbs energy as the helium becomes opaque without immediately raising the temperature. And this is what's key. So that compression doesn't immediately raise the temperature. The temperature stays roughly what it is as the outer helium layers become compressed. So the star shrinks. At that point, though, the temperature then rises because that helium is now opaque. With all the extra electrons running around, the radiation can't make it to the outer portion of the star. And so that radiation is actually immediately absorbed by the helium ions and the electrons. So at that point, the temperature then pretty significantly rises after a lag period, and the pressure inside rises. This sort of gives the outward pressure a head start, so to speak. The outer layers then expand, and right at the moment of their expansion, the helium recombines, becoming transparent. Actually, this should say transparent here. Becoming transparent again. And because it becomes transparent again, I'll go ahead and fix that. um, the temperature and pressure falls. So the whole cycle then leads back in on itself, and it looks a lot like hydrostatic equilibrium. There's just a lag at stages 2 and stage 5 because the temperature doesn't immediately do what you would expect. It doesn't immediately drop between 4 and 5, and it doesn't immediately rise between sort of 1 and 2. You get a lag. And as a result, the star has a massive variation on pretty short time scales between roughly 2 days or so and about 50, depending on the size of the Cepheid, where it grows in size by a factor of up to 100 times. So this is a massive effect, and it sort of breathes in and out. All right, so why does it matter? Well, we already said that this was going to be part of the distance ladder, and that Cepheid variables were standard candles. And the reason why is that the period with which they oscillate is related to how big they are. And therefore, the period with which they oscillate can tell you the peak luminosity of the variable. If you can measure the period, then you know the luminosity. So you take the period and you look at a graph like this. This is on a log scale. And you run along here. And so the period in days can give you the luminosity or the peak luminosity of that Cepheid. If we go to sort of type 1 Cepheids here, then with a period of 10 days, we see the luminosity is roughly 50,000 times, 5,000 times the luminosity of the sun, which is quite bright. That's the other thing to remember, is that these Cepheid variable stars are very bright stars, which means we can see them in local galaxies. All right, so once we have this period of oscillation, we take our data of the apparent brightness as it varies with time. We use that to get that period. So we take this, we measure the period, then we use the period to determine the peak luminosity. So we go on this graph and, let's say this period looks like it's about, 6 days or so. So if I go on this graph here, 6 days gives me a peak luminosity of, give or take, 3,000 times the luminosity of the sun. But now I have a measurement for the peak luminosity. So with the peak luminosity from this graph, and notice the brightness, the peak brightness of the Cepheid variable star, I can acquire the distance. This is an established, very reliable technique for acquiring the distance of nearby galaxies. So this is our first extragalactic measurement device. And it gives us distances up to about a few megaparsecs, which is the local group of galaxies, the nearby galaxies. They've got to be galaxies that are close enough so that we can identify particular stars. And that's not a huge percentage of all galaxies, but it's enough. Cepheid variables are a crucial step in the distance ladder. They bridge the gap between more conventional local methods and our very furthest methods of determining astronomical distances.